The organ's final note faded under the golden chandeliers of St. Michael's Cathedral in Chicago. The air shimmered with perfume and whispers, silk dresses rustling like soft waves. It was the kind of wedding the city would talk about for years, where wealth met power and every guest came to be seen. At the center of it all stood Julian Cross, the 34-year-old CEO of CrossTech. His white tuxedo gleamed beneath the lights. Beside him, Alyssa Monroe, daughter of a senator, smiled with the calm grace of someone born to privilege. The cameras were rolling, the choir's voices rose, and the priest began to speak of eternal vows. Then, from the far end of the aisle, a sound of quiet footsteps broke the rhythm. The heavy cathedral doors creaked open. Every head turned. A woman in a faded white dress stepped inside, holding a small bouquet of artificial lilies pressed to her chest. Her hair was silver, her hands trembling, her eyes soft with something deeper than pride-love. "Who is that?" someone whispered. Julian's body stiffened. He knew the walk, the scarf, the hands. It was his mother, Grace Cross. A wave of confusion rippled across the pews. Alyssa looked at him, puzzled. The cameras swiveled, hungry for the unexpected. Grace took one hesitant step after another, her eyes searching for her son. She stopped halfway down the aisle, her voice low but clear. "I'm sorry I wasn't invited," she said softly. "I just came to bless you, Julian." Julian's jaw clenched, his pulse thundered. For a brief second, memories flickered: warm bread, laughter, his mother's songs echoing through a small kitchen. But pride rushed in faster. "You shouldn't be here," he muttered. The whisper spread. "That's his mother," someone said. "She wasn't invited." Grace lowered her head. "I didn't mean to interrupt. I only wanted to see you happy." Something inside Julian snapped. The world closed and Alyssa's father watching, his colleagues whispering, the cameras zooming closer. He felt cornered by shame. "Get out," he said, louder this time. The choir went silent. The priest froze. Grace stood still, unsure whether she had heard correctly. Julian stepped forward, his voice sharper, angrier. "I said get out." The words echoed like a thunderclap. Grace's lips parted, her eyes wet but calm. "Julian, please." The sound came before thought. A single slap, hard and clean, cracked through the cathedral like glass breaking under pressure. Gas filled the air. The bouquet fell from her hands, rolling across the marble floor. Petals scattered like snow. Grace didn't fall. She only brought a trembling hand to her cheek. Her voice was steady, almost a whisper. "I didn't come to shame you, my son. I came to bless you." Julian's chest heaved. Cameras flashed. Alyssa's father looked away. Even the choir boys seemed frozen, their young faces pale. For a long moment, no one moved. The scent of lilies mixed with the silence. Then, quietly, Grace bent down, picked up her crushed bouquet, and turned toward the door. As she walked away, the sound of her shoes echoed across the marble, soft, deliberate, final. Outside, sunlight poured through the stained glass, glinting off her white scarf as if heaven itself had caught her tears. Inside, under the glow of chandeliers, Julian stood alone, surrounded by people but utterly isolated, his mother's blessing still hanging in the air like an unanswered prayer. Before that day at St. Michael's, Grace Cross lived quietly on the south side of Chicago in a small, aging apartment that smelled faintly of cinnamon and bread. Her days were simple: morning walks to the market, afternoons baking muffins for the neighborhood kids, and evenings spent in the dim light of a single lamp, humming old hymns while she read the Bible her late husband had given her. On the cracked wall above her stove hung a framed photograph: Julian at 15, grinning with a dusting of flour on his cheeks, holding one of her pies. That picture had yellowed with time, but it was still the first thing she looked at each morning. When news of Julian's upcoming wedding began to fill Chicago's gossip columns, Grace didn't hear it from him. She heard it from Mrs. Langley, the woman downstairs who sold newspapers. "Your boy's getting married to that senator's daughter," she said one morning with a smile. "You must be proud." Grace smiled back, though her hands trembled. "I'm proud, yes, always proud." She never received an invitation. Not a call. Not a letter. Not even a text. But 3 days before the wedding, a neighbor's daughter came by with a discarded envelope she had found at the local grocery store. The golden letters gleamed across the front: the wedding of Julian Cross and Alyssa Monroe. Grace held it gently, tracing her fingers over her son's name as though touching a memory. For a moment she imagined him as a boy again, running down the street with scraped knees and dreams bigger than the sky. Then she sighed, folded the card, and whispered to herself, "A mother's blessing doesn't need an invitation." That morning she opened her old wooden wardrobe. Inside hung a single white dress she had kept for Christmas, Massachusetts years ago. The fabric was faded and soft from too many washings, but she smoothed out the wrinkles with care. Around her neck, she fastened her wedding necklace, a small silver cross her husband had given her on their first anniversary. As she stepped outside, the winter wind swept through the empty street, lifting her white scarf. The city was loud with traffic and horns, but inside her chest was a stillness and ache that whispered both sorrow and love. Grace began walking towards St. Michael's Cathedral, bouquet in hand, her breath visible in the cold air. "I'll stand where he can still see me," she murmured, "even if it's from afar." By the next morning, the slap had become a headline. Every news outlet in Chicago carried the same grainy video, a groom in a white tuxedo, striking an elderly woman in front of hundreds of guests. The caption read, "Tech CEO Julian Cross slaps his mother during wedding ceremony." It spread across social media faster than any press release his company had ever paid for. At first, Julian tried to ignore it. He turned off his phone, closed the curtains, and told himself it would pass. But the world outside refused to stay quiet. Every time he opened his laptop, his mother's face appeared on the screen, still, calm, dignified, her hand resting against her cheek. The moment that had lasted 3 seconds now played on an endless loop. By noon, Crosstech's investors began calling. The board demanded a statement. Reporters crowded outside the glass tower downtown where Julian's office stood. The company's stock dropped 12% in a single day. Public relations warned that clients were withdrawing contracts, citing ethical concerns. Inside his penthouse, Julian sat at the kitchen counter, staring at his reflection in the dark window. The city glowed beneath him, yet he felt smaller than ever. On the marble table lay his wedding ring. Alyssa hadn't come home. She hadn't even texted. Only a single note waited on the counter, "I can't be part of this." He pressed his palms to his face, his thoughts racing. He could still hear the sound of that slap echo that had silenced the world. In his mind, it replayed against other sounds, his mother's laughter, the hum of her old radio, the clatter of dishes, as she packed his lunch before school. He remembered her hands, thin, calloused, always moving. They had baked every loaf of bread that paid for his college tuition. Those same hands had fixed his torn sleeves, brushed fever sweat from his forehead, and waved goodbye the day he left for his first job. How had those memories turned into shame? The following day, the radio hosts debated his downfall. "Can a man like Julian Cross recover from something like this?" One asked. "What does success even mean if you forget where you came from?" said another. Julian switched it off. He looked around his apartment, filled with designer furniture, awards and framed certificates. Every object screamed success, yet not one of them felt like home. His assistant called again. "Sir, the board needs a statement, something apologetic, human. They're panicking." He almost said yes, but words felt useless now. What apology could fix a wound that deep? By midnight, the video had reached millions of views. Comment sections overflowed with outrage and pity. The mother in white trended worldwide. Strangers defended Grace, calling her the saint of Chicago. Others demanded Julian step down. He sat alone, his name crumbling online while silence filled the room. Outside, snow drifted past the city lights, soft and slow. For the first time in his life, Julian Cross understood what true poverty felt like, the kind that has nothing to do with money, the kind that comes from losing love. 2 days passed before Julian finally left his apartment. The world outside had already made up its mind about him, but one question kept burning in his chest: where was his mother now? He drove aimlessly through the south side of Chicago, down streets he hadn't seen in years. The brick buildings looked smaller than he remembered. Every turn carried the scent of home fresh bread from the old bakery, gasoline from the corner station where he once begged his mother for candy. At last he stopped in front of a 2-story house with peeling paint and a crooked mailbox. It was where Grace had rented a small room for the past decade. He climbed the steps and knocked. A tired landlady answered, her gray hair tucked beneath a scarf. She looked at him closely, then her expression softened with recognition. "You're her boy," she said quietly. Julian's voice cracked. "Yes, I need to see her." The woman sighed and opened the door wider. "She left 3 days ago. Didn't tell no one where. Just said she was going home. She pointed toward a small wooden table in the hallway. "She left that for you." On the table lay a bundle of wilted flowers and a folded note. The paper was thin, the ink faded but steady. Julian picked it up with trembling hands. "If you return, don't look for me. I forgave you the moment your hand touched my face. Learn to bow your head, my son." For a long time he stood in silence, staring at those words. The room smelled of old rain and warm bread, and for a moment it felt as though she were still there, just in the next room, humming softly to herself. When he finally stepped outside, the wind carried the faint echo of church bells from miles away. He followed the sound until he found himself once again standing before St. Michael's Cathedral. The doors were locked, the stained glass windows dark, but he could still see the ghost of that moment, the bouquet rolling across the floor, the look in her eyes, the silence afterward. Julian walked up the steps and sank to his knees in front of the heavy wooden doors. His breath came in shallow bursts, mixing with the cold air. "God," he whispered, "I'd built towers that touched the clouds, but I forgot how to kneel." Snow began to fall, slow, quiet, relentless. Each flake melted against his skin, washing away the dust of pride. He stayed there for a long time, the city fading behind him, until only the wind remained, carrying the faint memory of a mother's voice, whispering forgiveness he didn't yet know how to accept. 3 days later, a knock echoed through Julian's office at Crossdeck. The world outside had quieted, though the whispers still lingered. A receptionist entered, carrying a small parcel wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. "This came for you," she said, leaving it on his desk. Julian stared at it for a long time before untying the knot. Inside was a folded white scarf, worn, soft and faintly scented with lavender. Beneath it lay a letter sealed with the crest of a small-town church. His hands shook as he opened it. "Dear Mr. Cross," it began, "I am Father O'Malley from St. Andrew's Parish in Meadowbrook. I write to inform you that your mother, Mrs. Grace Cross, passed away peacefully 2 nights ago. She was laid to rest beneath the old oak tree behind our chapel. She often spoke of you with love. She said her son would come home someday." Julian's vision blurred. The words refused to stay still on the page. He pressed the scarf to his face, breathing in what little was left of her soap, bread, and time. The world around him went still. For years he had chased everything the city promised: power, respect, control. Yet in that quiet office, none of it mattered anymore. That same evening he drove to Meadowbrook. The winter sky stretched endlessly, gray and low. When he reached the churchyard, the snow had covered most of the graves. A small wooden cross stood beneath the oak, her name carved by hand, Grace Cross, "A mother's love never ends." Julian knelt in the snow. The cold burned his knees, but he didn't move. He placed the wilted bouquet he had carried since that day at the cathedral on her grave. "I came too late, Mama," he whispered. "You forgave me, but I can't forgive myself." The wind stirred through the oak branches above, shaking down a few dry leaves. One landed gently on his shoulder, as if her hand had found him once more. He stayed there until the last light faded, alone with the silence of a love that had outlived him. Weeks passed before Julian returned to Chicago. The city looked the same, bright, loud, indifferent, but he was no longer the same man who had left it. His office still bore his name in silver letters, yet it felt like a stranger's door. He had lost everything that once defined him: the company, the marriage, the applause. But in losing all of that, he had found something he didn't know he was missing: clarity. He spent his nights rereading his mother's letters, each one a small map leading him back to humility. Her last words echoed in his head: "Turn your tears into light for other mothers." Those lines became the seed of a new purpose. 2 months later, the newspapers ran a new headline: "Julian Cross launches the White Mother Foundation." The announcement was simple: no sponsors, no press conference. Just a quiet statement: "For every mother forgotten by her children, may this be a place of remembrance." The foundation began in a rented space downtown. The walls were bare at first, except for one framed photograph: a boy and his mother in a tiny kitchen, covered in flour and laughter. Beneath it, engraved on a brass plate, were the words: "Forgiveness is not silence, it's the seed of change." Julian refused any salary. He sold his remaining shares in Crossdeck and donated the proceeds to open shelters for elderly women, single mothers, and widows. Each week he personally served food at the community center. People often recognized him, but he didn't hide. When someone asked if he was that man from the video, he simply nodded. "Yes," he said, "but I'm trying to become someone different now." The city began to notice. Local reporters called it the redemption of Julian Cross, but he rejected the word. "This isn't redemption," he told them. "It's prevention, so no child ever repeats my mistake." Slowly, donations poured in. Volunteers arrived. Within 6 months, the foundation expanded to 3 locations: Chicago, Detroit, and Milwaukee. On the day of the grand opening, a journalist asked him what inspired it all. Julian smiled faintly. A woman who walked 3 miles in winter just to give her son a blessing he didn't deserve. Inside the main hall, light streamed through tall windows, falling over rows of white lilies arranged along the walls. Elderly women sat at long tables, eating warm soup and laughing with volunteers. Julian watched them quietly, hands folded. In their faces he saw his mother's kindness multiplied 100 times. That evening, after the guests had left, he stood alone in the hall. The room was still except for the sound of wind outside. He looked up at the photograph of Grace and whispered, "I hope you can see this, Mama. I hope you know I finally learned how to bow." For the first time in months, he smiled not with pride, but with peace. The kind that comes only after forgiveness has done its quiet work. A year later, spring came early to Meadowbrook. The grass around the old oak tree had turned green again, and the wooden cross over Grace's grave stood firm against the breeze. On a quiet Sunday morning, Julian returned not as a CEO, not as a man haunted by scandal, but simply as a son. He knelt before her resting place, setting down a fresh bouquet of white daisies. The wind moved gently through the branches, the same sound he remembered from childhood. "You taught me, Mama," he whispered, "that love doesn't need apologies. It just needs to continue." He stayed there until the sun climbed higher, and for the first time since her passing, the ache in his chest felt lighter, like something sacred had finally come full circle. As he stood, a gust of wind lifted his mother's old white scarf from his hands and carried it across the field. It danced in the air before resting softly on his shoulders. Julian smiled through his tears. "I hear you," he murmured. "I won't stop." Months later, the foundation held a memorial service for all the mothers it had helped that year. Candles lined the steps, flickering like tiny souls of light. Julian spoke only once. In life, some apologies come too late, but change can still arrive on time. He looked out at the crowd and added quietly, "If your mother is still here, call her today. If she's gone, do something good in her name, because no spotlight will ever shine brighter than a mother's love." As the choir began to sing, a white petal drifted down from the balcony, landing near his feet, a small, silent blessing finding its way home.